everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the expert panel involving media content landscapes and recommendation systems. My name is Yuting Duan, and I am the head of content understanding at Scale. We've got a great panel for you today, and I'm really excited to be talking to them. Our panelists are Curtis Huang, head of content understanding at Snap, and Tony Jabara, VP of Engineering and Head of ML at Spotify. To kick things off, why don't we start with some introductions? Curtis, we can start with you and move on to Tony next. So tell the audience a little bit about you, your background, and what are you working on currently?
Thank you, Eugene. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Curtis Huang. I run the content understanding team here at Snap. Prior to Snap, so I joined Snap earlier this year. My team focused on building the AI capabilities for us to understand the content for our recommendation systems. And prior to Snap, I spent about 7 years at Facebook. I also run the ML and Data Foundations team there.
Tony?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Jabara. I am VP of Engineering, and I lead machine learning at Spotify across all the functions. And primarily, that includes how we recommend content to users through our homepage, our search, our programming platform, which is ways of grouping content into, let's say, collections, understanding our users and how they're doing, understanding our content in terms of music understanding, as well as talk understanding, as well as understanding our user journey. And so I'm very excited to be talking to you today about how we do recommendation and content understanding and really personalization. And I'm dialing in here today from our San Francisco office out here in California.
Oh, can we visit next time?
Sure, please do.
Sounds great. Okay, super excited to have you here. Let's jump right in. To set a little bit context, media content comes in many different forms, from the traditional media platforms with professionally developed content, Spotify, Netflix, to social media platforms with user-generated content, Snap, and everything in between. So we will be exploring the importance of the recommendation systems, the data that powers them in an ever-evolving media platform and content ecosystem, as well as how they tie it into growing businesses. So to start, I want to discuss a little bit about how the media landscapes have evolved. So my first set of questions for you today are, what are some of the new trends or new user patterns that you have observed on your platform, and how have these experiences changed in the past few years? Tony, we can start with you.
Sure. So as everyone knows, Spotify started as a music streaming service, and we were mostly thinking about recommending music content and playlists and so on to users. But we've seen a very rapid evolution through our investments in podcasts, and podcast adoption has grown really rapidly. And podcast formats have also broadened from short form, long form, serial, let's say different types of topics, storytelling, etc. So we've seen a really explosive growth in that content category. And in addition, throughout the pandemic, we've actually seen accelerated creation. And so the number of creators, has more than tripled, I would say, in the podcast category, because of people being at home and creating this content more easily from home for sharing and wanting to reach and connect to many people all over the world with their stories. And so that's been a real change for us. We've evolved so that it's a key part of our catalog. And we're also seeing interesting consumption patterns that are different. So of course, consumption of music is a short 3-minute track, but in podcasts, we're talking about hours of consumption, coming back to episodes and other, let's say, habitual types of routines, which are very different than music consumption. And so we've definitely seen a different dimension of how our users engage with Spotify. And that's been very exciting, as well as new challenges as well.
That's super exciting. And Curtis, what are your perspective on this?
Sure. Yeah. On Snap, we began as a messaging app that allows people to connect with their close friends. And I think over the last few years, we have expanded into different formats. And so similar on the creator side, I personally feel that the best way to show a piece of content is through the storytelling. And at Snap, we have a lot of these story creation tools that allows people and creators to express their creativity and to connect with their audience. So there's a lot of different, fun tools that allows, so for example, like lenses and emoji, and, people kind of try to leverage all these augmented reality, to enhance the experience of the content creation. On the consumption side, we also saw that there's a kind of an increased interest in like the short form video. So on Snapchat app now we have the Spotlight product. We actually is a short form video recommendation, and there we definitely see a lot of interest in continue to kind of explore through these kind of more kind of coherent set of experience and continue to view and watch these short form videos. And I believe that we definitely noticed that there's an increased change in how the viewers actually would like to contribute to the overall viewer experience, right? By providing more explicit feedback by watching it longer, and also trying to engage with the content itself through the replies feature, etc. So very exciting times.
That's super exciting, and it's really interesting to hear like both of you talk about, right, how like the ways of consumption is changing, it's increasing, the number of creators are increasing. The platform that most audience will probably think are very different, but we're seeing a lot of very similar themes. Thank you for sharing that. Cool. Okay, so what role do you see recommendation systems playing in adapting these new patterns? Curtis, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think personally, like I mentioned, on the viewer side, I definitely see that the viewers would like to take more control in their viewing experience. So, for example, I think a lot of these products right nowadays, they allow you to say, oh, show more or show less, right? They provide explicit preference feedback to the recommendation system. And it's very important for the recommendation system to be able to accommodate their kind of session intent, so that they will be able to kind of adapt to their needs during the moment. I think you also know that right now our users have a very high bar in terms of their content quality, right? So they actually have they're becoming less patient in terms of like waiting and seeing a piece of content that don't seem relevant to them. So I think, yes, definitely the recommendations needs to kind of keep up with the user pattern there.
One thing we've learned is also the recommendation, personalization, and machine learning technology is becoming even more important because we're seeing bigger and bigger catalogs. So we've got almost 100 million tracks. We've got over 4.5 million podcasts times, a dozen plus episodes per podcast. So again, think of that amount of content as well. And we just recently launched audiobooks, which is adding hundreds of thousands of books to our catalog as well. And so the problem of finding what is relevant, what is valuable, what is engaging is actually now growing quite quickly, because we have to connect almost 500 million people to about 500 million pieces of content. And so that problem becomes much more challenging as the numbers on both sides of that connection grow, finding where the value is, not just where the click is also, but where is the real value. So we can make someone click, but do they really find this a fulfilling, engaging piece of content is becoming much harder, much more of a complicated, let's say, scientific problem almost. And then also, when you're trying to recommend all this content, what we've realized with music, it's pretty easy to figure out in about 30 seconds if you like a song or not. With podcasts, you need about 20 minutes to really say, hey, this is content that I'm interested in. And then with a book, you might need hours to really say this is a book for me. And so we're also realizing that there's very different aspects of how much time a user is interested in engaging with the content. And a click might be easy to do, but an hour of listening to really evaluate something is actually a very expensive proposition. So that's another aspect that's really been changing and has been challenging. So growing catalog, and also content with very different types of behaviors behind it, from a 30-second track to a book that might take you weeks to actually consume.
Super interesting. So just to double click on that, we talk about like the challenges that we're facing with those new user patterns. So more going into more like technical details, like how has those actually changed, the ways we are building or adapting these recommendation systems to work around those challenges.
So we've been adapting where we're really trying to understand what is the value and really understand when you actually engage with this content, have you increased the user's, let's say, long-term retention, and have you built a habit, as opposed to have you just gotten an immediate next click. And so it's pretty easy to get clicks, especially when you recommend a song I've already listened to a day or two ago. Click maximization will not figure this out. You have to really understand the long-term outcomes when you get that recommendation and discovery to happen. And so if you get someone to discover a podcast, we're starting to realize we have to understand the long-term value of that discovery, not just let's say the click-through rate of that podcast. It might have a low click-through rate, but once you actually start engaging with it, you'll keep coming back every week for that next episode and really build a habit around it. And so even if it's got a lower click-through rate than this other, let's say, piece of content, it may actually create a long-term habit. And so we have to understand that almost through the lens of, let's say, these long-term machine learning techniques, from reinforcement learning to other types of lifetime value modeling that capture long-term delayed consequences, as opposed to just an instant, binary click, yes or no, on the proposed recommendation.
That's really cool. Curtis, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that you wanted to share as well.
Yeah, in addition to what Tony just said, I think it's also very important for us to kind of consider building out these deeper content understanding capabilities because the users that definitely would like to match with their interests. And we need to build out these kind of maybe better representation on the input on the signal side so that we can match the user and their content, their particular interest. And as I mentioned, I think the kind of consumption has become more like a kind of a sequential type of thing. So being able to understand like real-time feedback is very important. So maybe there are some things that has already been done in terms of like incorporating these negative preferences and be able to kind of adapt in session according to kind of the user's interaction with the recommendation engine, I think will be the key here.
That's interesting. So on one hand, we actually want to measure like the short session, like be very adaptive. But on the other hand, we're trying to measure the long-term value. That's quite interesting. And that definitely sounds like, the industry as a whole is evolving in a very exciting direction. So next up, I actually want to take a step back. We already talked about some of the content, but I actually want to dive a little bit deeper into the recommendation systems. So we already talked about some of the challenges. I'm curious to hear, like, what is the number one thing that you are thinking about when developing a recommendation system, either in a technical or more interesting, like, an organizational way, which, I feel like we don't really talk about that often. So Curtis, I guess we can start with you this time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the recommendation system in general. I'm actually, so I would like to kind of approach this in kind of sort of like a quality perspective, right? I believe that there's definitely a lot of things that we can tune here and there. We have different kind of model architectures. We have different ways to define our objective functions. But I think most importantly is actually the quality of the signals, right? And we all know that the recommendation system is a direct reflection of how the users are interacting with the system. So I think, to start, like the number one thing is definitely on the quality side. And on the quality side, I do mean kind of two things. Like number one is the quality of the content itself. As you mentioned before, right, we definitely have different types of content here. We have some that are more kind of premium. There are also some that are user generated. So being able to make sure that they continue to have high quality against our policies, we hold ourselves at a very high bar in terms of like making sure that only high quality contents are recommended to our system. On the machine learning side, right, I think the quality of the signals itself, as I mentioned, is very important. Being able to learn and generate these general purpose representations through like the sequential model that we mentioned, or building out this taxonomy and content understanding capabilities, I believe will be the key to the success. And then I think I also sort of kind of beat this to death, but I do believe that online adaptive learning is something that is going to be very important going forward, especially the user expected the models to quickly adapt during the session. Yeah.
Yeah, so plus one to what Curtis is saying, I think you do need great data before you can build a machine learning recommendation engine. And so getting great data about what's happening with your users, how they're using the app, what events are they triggering, what are they getting impressed, what is the content that was already recommended to them, what are they searching for. You have to really understand a lot of the data that the users are working with and generating while they try to explore the catalog, as well as what you've recommended to them, understanding your own, let's say, production bias. And then that way, you can really connect all that event data into a user journey and start to understand what users are going through in order to recommend to others, let's say, based off of those user journeys, kind of a collaborative filtering approach. So here's how one user progressed through a catalog. We can now recommend a similar journey to someone who's in the initial stages of that journey. So that's super important. Understanding also your causal impact. So being able to A/B test is super important with your recommendation engines. A lot of times, it's pretty straightforward to assume your recommendation engine did something when really the user already knew the content existed and found it for themselves. So what is your causal impact on the user behavior is something that really can only perfectly be done through randomized A/B tests. And so setting that up on day one is also super important. The other thing to understand is content is always getting richer and more interesting. And so really having great content understanding and basically ways of representing content, be it video for podcasts and audiobooks, music, and other types of live events. We have to really map all of those into an embedding, a vector almost that describes them. And so we have to build these types of embeddings that capture what the content is about. That involves lots of machine learning technologies, all mapping into like a vector, and then also mapping users into a vector space. And then you can really start to say, hey, this user is like this other user, this content's kind of like this other content. And those are, I think, the first steps of building the recommendation engine. I think all of those kind of pieces really come together, and then you can start to really help provide a value to the users.
That's super exciting. We'll talk about data. This ties very closely to my next question. We talk about data, we talk about metrics. It's really hard to measure, right? For example, we talk about A/B testing. It's really easy to measure some of the shorter term metrics, but it's harder to measure the longer term, right? So for the two of you, how are you thinking about in terms of, all the metrics that we have, like how are you thinking about in terms of tiering and in terms of balancing between the algorithm metrics, user metrics, as well as like the business metrics?
It is a great question about how we think about the metrics. And we have a suite of metrics in our metrics catalog, what we do A/B testing with. We try to look at local short-term metrics. So of course, things that we know and can simply measure, like did the user click and how often, these types of things are standard. But we've also been looking at longer-term metrics, like are users consuming over the stretch of an A/B test of, let's say, a month or two, have they actually consumed totally more audio than in this treatment versus this control? So that's a very different type of metric. It's not like a click-through rate, it's actually total consumption. And we're trying to see if we increase total consumption or if we increase total retention. Those are things we look at, but we have to run the test longer and at higher levels of power to capture those types of effects. We look at both short-term and long-term like that in our A/B tests. And one recent thing we've been doing is predictive metrics that capture long-term effects but can be measured in a short-term horizon. So we, for example, predict the LTV of a user on a, let's say, 60-month, horizon through a predictive model. This model takes all sorts of inputs and local features to say, here's the LTV. And so we see how these predicted metrics change also in an A/B test. Think of those as a surrogate. So there's short-term metrics, long-term metrics, and predicted surrogate metrics. So those are the three we've really been looking at in lots of our tests.
That's really cool. So we're actually leveraging ML to complement the A/B testing results. That's really cool. Curtis, what do you think?
Plus one to everything that Tony has said. And I think you also mentioned that there's definitely an objective function to be tuned here, right? So there's definitely multiple objectives in some cases where we like to see how the creators are doing and how our viewers are doing. and how to develop such objective functions and be able to kind of test and have interpretable results is actually something that we have been kind of working on, and having the ability to kind of jointly optimize, right, so that we are not trapped in a local minimum or something that's only good for our viewers and hurts our kind of creator ecosystem is something that it's something I want to add here.
That's really cool. Cool. Okay. So for the sake of time, let's move on to the next section. For next section, this is the one that I'm most excited. Let's talk about the future. So based on all those learnings and observations, including how the content platform are evolving, as well as how the technology are surrounding those content platforms are evolving. So how do you see the recommendation engine changing over the next few years? And what are some of the challenges that you foresee? And what are you most excited about?
Yeah, I'll probably take a first step. So on the challenge, I'll start with the challenges. I definitely feel that it's important for the community, ML community here, to focus on privacy and fairness, and definitely there's having kind of a lot of these requirements from like GDPR and and then the DPA that actually protects, right, the personal data, and having a way to be able to kind of personalize while honoring these kind of privacy will continue to be one of the ongoing challenges for the ML community here. And I think something that I'm super excited about, right, there are definitely solutions that are out there that allows us to be able to handle that. And I also want to say that I think on the explainability side, it's also very important. As I mentioned, I think there are many products that shows that the users are really appreciate the reason why they're seeing such recommendations, right? And going back to what I mentioned earlier, they would like to take more control in the session themselves, right? So being able to understand and why this piece of content is being shown to them, and being able to have them to have this real-time feedback loop is really going to go a long way. And that is something I'm personally very passionate and happy about.
Quick question for you on like the explainability side. Like, do you have some examples you can share with our audience? Because it's an area that's so interesting. But I think the general consensus, like our recommendation engine has become so powerful that it's really hard sometimes for an ML engine to know, right, like what's going on here.
Yeah, it really depends on how the model was built. And I believe that a while ago, right, Netflix also had this, right? So maybe there's some associated learning, maybe during kind of embedding and similarity, they will be able to kind of explain why a certain recommendation was made this way. And I think we also mentioned, right, on the social network, this is a kind of community, kind of a graph base, and there might be some, explainability going on there to understand, like, oh, the reason why you're seeing this is because maybe one of your close friends was also watching or seeing this piece of content. On the ML side, yeah, definitely very excited. I think there are sort of papers and literature that talk about ways of doing explainability. So maybe one way was to kind of sort of use the attention mechanisms for us to understand like why the model is making certain recommendations, and that might be one way for us to surface those explainabilities. Yeah.
Do you expect that to turn into something that will be like consumer user facing anytime soon?
Well, I think on the recommendation side, it's sort of already happening. I don't know, but I think some social network that I also personally use, I think you can actually go into different kind of exploration mode, right? So you can kind of start browsing kind of a feed, and then you started to see some kind of topic of your interest, right? And then it's sort of like an inherent choice, right? You just go and say, oh, I want to look at more like baseball, for example, or football, and then you can just go and have like a deep dive session. So I believe that there's sort of also a way for you to turn that into a product that allows the user to declare what they're interested in this session and be able to kind of do the explainability in that way. The prerequisite is that it needs to be a coherent set of videos or experience, right, for users to really understand that was actually the topic. So that's something that definitely content understanding will be important there.
Makes sense. Cool. Okay, Tony, let's switch over to you. Also curious about your perspective here. Like, how are you seeing the recommendation engine changing over the few years? Some of the challenges, and what are you most excited about?
Yeah, I think the world is getting, let's say, bigger expectations for what recommendation systems should do for them, and more of a accountability for both the consumers and the creators for what the recommendation systems do. So explanation is one part of it, as Curtis was saying. So can you explain why I'm getting this thing recommended to me? Is it because it's content that's relevant for me, or is it something that just launched and we're just doing a newly launched content? We try to explain some of these things already with our systems by saying, here's, let's say, a new playlist that's popular with listeners who like X, where X is a track you've listened to. So, if you like Olivia Rodrigo, here's a playlist for you because you like Olivia Rodrigo, or based on your recent listening, or made for you based on your favorite artists or your favorite podcasters. And so we explain these recommendations. That gives us more of this explainability. Why are we amplifying this and recommending it? Oh, it's related to something that gives you the relevance, or it's something that just launched, and this is part of a promotion and spotlight. An artist just launched an album, so that also makes you understand why that's popping up. So that is an aspect of, let's say, recommendation for the consumers that's being improved. There's also regulation around this as well. So we try to make sure, for example, we're fair and our algorithms are giving all consumers equal value. And it's not like the algorithms are only optimized for, this demographic. It's actually, we're trying to look at fairness on the consumer side. But even on the creator side, I think creators are also asking for that extra fairness and accountability, where they want to see their content get out there and reach listeners who would be interested in it. So how have you fairly, let's say, explored new content from some emerging artists and creators, and making sure you're fair across the dimensions of artists? Are you giving female and male artists an equal shot for things like that? And so we're looking at the fairness of the recommendation systems. We're also trying to understand the long-term effects of the recommendation systems to avoid things like filter bubbles and rabbit holes and just click-based optimization. So that's another, I think, futuristic journey of where recommendation systems have to evolve to, because it's not just where it was a few years ago, where it was good enough to just maximize clicks. We've seen where clickbait can land you. We've seen where rabbit holes and other types of filter bubbles can land you. So if you think about the long term, are you doing the right thing for that consumer for the long term? Are you doing the right thing for the creator and their career in the long term? So how do you see a recommendation engine helping these long-term outcomes for creators and consumers?
That's really cool. Okay, we actually are at our last question for today, which is based on some of the challenges. Going to the more interesting details is like, how do we see the organizations/companies, shift to solve around those problems? So, for example, when we talk about like fairness, like, do we expect companies to start to form like organizations around that? Do we expect like a third party organization? Like, anything that you have in terms of like, how will the organization like evolve to address those challenges?
I can jump in. Because today we announced that we acquired a company that's helping us with the safety of content. So we're investing in content understanding and content safety. So we've acquired a company called Kinzen that's just been recently announced. And we're also investing in human, let's say, evaluation of our content as well. So these types of investments, not just on the recommendation engine, but on technologies to understand the content and filter it for safety, and with human and algorithms, I think are investment areas that many organizations that are facing consumers like Spotify today are investing in. So definitely investments in, content understanding, content safety, and of course on both the human and the algorithmic sides. And that's I think something that many companies are starting to ramp up on, and we've definitely invested and continue to invest in.
Curtis, what do you think?
Yeah, so actually, I also support the content moderation team here. We definitely have a lot of investment in making sure that the quality, follows quality of the content actually follows our policies. And also, I would say, like, I think Snap is a really kind of privacy first kind of company, right? I think we started as a private messaging app. So I would even go on and say like this is actually baked in our DNA. So all the engineers and all the practitioners here, and also including product and everyone is here to make sure that we have hold ourselves to the higher standard, both in terms of the privacy, fairness, and also some of the safety concerns that we have. So I personally will say this will continue to be an area that we will definitely invest in, and to make sure that we have the right and healthy ecosystem for our creator and our user and Snapchatters.
Content safety is something that we unfortunately don't have time to touch on, but it's so important. It's so foundational. Okay, so that's actually all the time we have for today. Tony and Curtis, I want to thank you again for being here today and for sharing all the insights. And hopefully our audiences will be as excited as we are to see more companies and organizations leveraging the recommendation systems, see new content come online, and to see how the recommendation system really bring the best-in-class user experiences in the next few years. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ting. Great talking to all of you today, and hope the rest of the conference goes great. And also come say hi and whenever you have a chance.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, looking forward to seeing you all at the conference.
All right.